Welcome to the Living Out podcast, helping people, churches and society talk about faith and sexuality.
Welcome to the Living Out podcast. My name's Andy, and you've joined us in series 15 of the Living Out podcast, where we're thinking through how those who experience same-sex attraction can flourish. And this time, we're dealing with the topic of change, whether we should try to change, what happens when we do try to change, and so on. And we'll get into that topic shortly. But I'm delighted to be joined by guests from two different countries. Jeanette, I was going to say an old friend of the podcast, but that might feel mildly offensive. So Jeanette, who's based in the UK, and thrilled to have Simon with us. So Simon, do you want to tell us where you're from, because you're not based in the UK, and what you do?
Yeah. I am based in Sydney, Australia, in the inner west of Sydney, a suburb called Summerhill, where I work part-time as an assistant minister at my local church in Summerhill, which is a great joy and privilege. I look after a lot of kids ministry, and I love it. It's really fun. But I also spend a little bit of my time working for an organization a little bit similar to Living Out, but like the down under version called Living Faith, where we kind of think about sexuality and faith and gender and help equip churches to talk about these topics in a way that is encouraging and helpful.
Great to have you with us. And Jeanette, you've been on this a few times, but do you want to introduce yourself for us?
Sure. Yes, I'm Jeanette. I'm based in Eastbourne, and I've spent the past 42 years talking about this subject. So, yeah, you'll get the same old stories probably from me.
You are a fine example to us of keeping going.
Mm.
Now, last year we did an episode, again, thinking about change in sexuality. And actually, our producer has given me the same question to ask because we weren't on it. I have to admit, those who know me well will know I hate this question, but I'm obedient. So I'm going to follow Ashley's instructions and ask it anyway, because it's on the theme of change. So if you changed into an animal, what would it be?
Even better than that, I've got a breed. I would be a cockapoo.
Okay,
Which is a dog. Yes,
it's a
I can
dog.
see
Sorry.
that. The long face. And yeah, it's a dog,
Yeah, okay.
and it's a mixture of a cocker spaniel and a poodle.
Excellent. That's wonderful, Jeanette. Simon, have you got an animal?
Yes, I was hanging out with a friend just before recording this, and so I said to him, "What do I say to this question? What animal should I be?" And we realized it should be an Australian animal. That seems only appropriate. So we went with a platypus, because in some ways they feel like they don't quite make sense. Why do they really exist? They do a whole lot of things. They're busy all over the place, and they love being by creeks and rivers, and I love creeks and rivers. So that's what I went with, platypus.
Okay. I think I would go for a cheetah, basically so I could run away from people asking me irritating questions very quickly. So I think that's where I would land. But anyway, we've spent more than enough time on that question, haven't we? So let's get going into the podcast. So as I say, we've had you both on the podcast before. I think Simon just once before. So perhaps, Simon, you could just give us a potted reminder of your story of faith and sexuality.
Yeah, thanks. I think it was a couple of years ago now that I was on last time. I think my story is one of kind of reconciling sexuality with faith. You know, I grew up in a Christian household. My grandfather was a minister. I really didn't have a day where I didn't know Jesus as Lord. And so, my faith journey is really intermeshed with figuring out what sexuality looks like for me, and really trying to figure out how those things could go together and what does it look like to live with those things together, which I think we'll probably talk about a little bit more in this episode of the podcast. But yeah, it was a real process of realizing what was going on in my life and in my heart and in my mind, and kind of a period of confusion, of not quite knowing what that means, and then a really long period of trying to understand what does it look like for me to be faithful to Jesus in the position that I'm in, and talking to friends and other ministers of really trying to work that out. And I think that was kind of has been quite a long thread in my faith journey, really, and both the source of great challenge in my faith as a Christian, but also I think one of the biggest sources of my own growth in maturity as a Christian as well at the same time. So, I never expected to be in the position where I'm on a podcast talking about this, partially because I'm in ministry for talking about how these things go together. I think even 5 years ago, if someone told me that, I would run away in the other direction. So it's been a real surprising journey on multiple levels, figuring out how these things go together and then figuring out what it looks like for me to be in ministry in the position I'm in. It's been a journey that God is definitely in control of because I've never felt particularly in control of.
Oh, thanks for that, Simon. Funnily enough, I can echo so much of that, actually. I think if you told me certainly probably 15 years ago that I'd be on a podcast for random strangers, as it were, talking about sexuality, I wouldn't have believed it. So, Jeanette, many of us will have heard your story before, but for you, in a sense, becoming a Christian quite a while back now. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that very briefly?
Yes, I wasn't brought up in a Christian household, um, but we did go to church. So I always believed in God and all of that. But certainly there wasn't a personal commitment. From the time I can remember, I felt different, and that kind of morphed into attraction. I also had gender dysphoria, so I really wanted to be a boy and would dress accordingly. Um, and then I got into relationships, same-sex relationships, and I was in a long-term one in Australia, actually, Simon, and was teaching at a Christian school, and kind of got interested in Christianity, but also knew that homosexual activity and active Christianity were not compatible. No one said anything to me, I just knew it. But in the end, God won out. So, yeah, I became a Christian when I returned to the UK. So that was January 1985.
Oh, we're very, very glad. I guess for all of us, though, one of the questions that then emerges is, okay, we're now living for Jesus. We're experiencing attraction to people of the same sex. Is that something we should try to change? Simon, have you wrestled with that a little bit in your story?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I think I hinted that a little bit before. And as I was reflecting on this before recording, I was thinking I kind of have had phases along the journey of figuring out what it looks like with that question. I think my initial figuring out and kind of coming to terms with my attraction was very much of a like, I don't want it. I don't want to be here. I'd give anything for this to not be the case. And so there was a real long period of that kind of wrestle of really wanting to change. And then I think as I kind of came to realize this doesn't feel like it's going anywhere, I feel like I had an opposite reaction of I don't think I understand who I was if it did change. It was very staunchly in thinking this is a core part of who I am. And if it changed, I think I'd be a bit lost in who I am. And that was kind of the next phase. And I feel like now I'm in more of a phase where I think I don't really expect it to change. But I also think if it did change, I'd survive and I'd be okay and I'd still be me. There's a sense of like holding a little bit more loosely to those things, as I've been growing and maturing in what it means to be a Christian and what it means to follow Jesus and even just to be a person. I think I've kind of settled in a more in between place of kind of accepting that this seems like it will be my lifelong story, but also thinking if attractions change, and they do for some people, I would still be me, and I would be okay. Um, yeah, that's kind of a little potted version of what I've been through as I process that question.
Hmm. Thanks, Simon. That's really helpful. Jeanette, what would be your story? Because I guess for you, trying to change was quite a a process that lasted a while, wasn't it?
Yes, it was indeed. And you've got to remember, I'm of my time.
Hmm.
So uh, there was nothing to read. There were obviously there wasn't an internet. So I just stopped my behavior. The Just Stop It campaign. And it was 3 years later, I was in North Wales and came across Frank Worthen's book coming out of homosexuality. It's the first time I'd ever read anything in my life. And I contacted the ministry and ended up going over to California in 1988 for a live-in program. So I was there for 3 years, and it I grew as a Christian, but there was an awful lot of talk about change. It was this kind of because Frank had changed and other people had changed, and said no, they don't have temptations anymore or thoughts anymore or anything like that. There was this general within the states at the time that change was a natural response to addressing issues, absorbing the Bible, being more Christ-like would change how you felt. That was quite a pressure.
Mm.
Yeah, and I mean that sounds like it was quite a hard process, was it?
Yes, but I mean, it was a hothouse because I couldn't earn money. I was working in volunteering in the ministry office. I shared a condo with 5 other women, all addressing their same sexual attraction, and then we had meetings in the evening. So it was this furnace, really,
Mm.
and they ended up being great friends, the deepest friends I've ever had. But my word, it was iron against iron for the first 18 months, I guess. But this whole and I taught change too, you know, and for 15 years, and I kept thinking I'm not changing. And so there was I felt an awful lot of pressure on me and also a sense of failure. I'd done all I could, but there was still no change. And then in the year 2000, and I'd been ill with severe depression and everything. And I thought, I'm just going to stop trying to change. And that was a very freeing time for me. It's like, okay, this is how I feel. I can't, you know, I'm not working at it anymore. I'm just going to be a Christian who's being transformed like every other Christian,
Mm.
and not this driver of change of sexuality that had become so big and so burdensome, really.
Mm.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, so I think I sort of slot into the sort of generation between you two, if that makes sense. So my story a little bit different. So actually, probably again, not many people talking about it very much. Not a lot of resources out there, but probably with less of the sort of pressure of change is necessary in order to be able to live the Christian life. I mean that meant probably university was the sort of key time for me where nobody knew, so I hadn't talked to anybody. It was a sort of secret thing I was living with, and I mean, no sort of courses that I went on, but certainly I remember praying pretty much every Sunday in church. The thing that I would be praying would be, Lord, take this away from me, take this away from me, take this away from me. And almost hoping something miraculous would take place and there'd sort of be a 180-degree turn, partly because of a fair amount of shame, because of probably in a sense longing, it'd be quite nice to get married at some point and so on. Funny enough, this is quite encouraging for somebody who's mainly now a preacher. It was actually a sermon that did sort of transform things for me. So I remember Sunday morning hearing 2 Corinthians 12 preached, so Paul's thorn in the flesh, and not particularly suggesting that Paul's thorn in the flesh was same-sex attraction. I don't assume that was the case at all, but in a sense that they felt things that were similar. Messenger of Satan at one level here is something Satan can use to get at people, but I say Paul prays 3 times, take it away from me. I think by that point, partly because of the pain of it, I think I prayed 333 times, Lord, take this away from me. And I remember the sermon just coming straight at me, actually seeing a purpose in a thorn. Actually, it's the thing that the Lord uses to keep Paul, and I guess by extension us, from being proud, conceited. And you just get that lovely promise, my grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in weakness. And it was, that for me was one of those moments where it did just feel like the Spirit was applying a sermon very directly to me. In a way that probably hadn't occurred to me. I kind of assumed that to live the Christian life well, my sexuality had to be 180 degree changed. And suddenly a sense of the Lord can use this to help me to depend on Him. Not at all saying sin is right. Don't mean that for a moment, but just in a sense the fact that the thorn, which is both for me temptation and suffering, is all mixed in with the thorn of same-sex attraction. Just that sense the Lord probably wasn't going to take it away, and He had good purposes in that. And probably from that moment onwards, the pressure to change stopped somewhat.
Mm. Yeah, I that verse was really important for me as well. I think I remember, thinking that, oh, here's this example that's in scripture of here's this thing that he wants to be taken away and God's not taking it away. And I was thinking, oh, I've spent a long time praying that it would be taken away and it hasn't been. So I think similarly that verse was one that did help, maybe not quite as clearly in the sermon as you, but did help start for me to think, oh, maybe this is not ever going away. And maybe my question is, how do I live faithfully in this scenario rather than trying to escape the scenario? Because I think actually those years of trying to pray to change my sexuality was so demoralizing and discouraging for me because I'd pray and pray and pray and pray and pray and nothing would change. And I'd think, well, God's not listening to me. Why is He not answering these prayers? And that verse similarly was a real encouragement for me to just shift that mindset and think slightly differently.
I don't think I would be as mature as a Christian if I hadn't been, if God had taken it away. I do remember on really bad days going, God, why can't I just have a normal problem? I do remember those kind of naive prayers. It's like, can I trade this problem for, I don't know, theft or something? But it is, isn't it? Always, we've just got to have that long-term perspective, because day to day can be rubbish and can be lonely and can be a million things. It's also transient, but our future is guaranteed, our inheritance. And gosh, if we can just keep our eyes on that gets us through today's rubbish.
Andrew here. Do you ever find yourself having conversations about sexuality or gender where it feels like you're talking past each other, or perhaps something is going on below the surface but you're not quite sure what? Or maybe you've talked to people who just can't get their heads around a Christian perspective on sexuality or gender, or maybe you feel you can't make sense of it at all. Well, if that's you, I've got a book that I think is just what you need. My book, Getting God's Perspective, a short Christian introduction to worldviews, sexuality and gender, explores how different perspectives on sexuality and gender are often flowing from different beliefs on fundamental worldview topics like origins, authority and freedom. The book explores the worldview of secular Western society and the Christian worldview, and shows how those worldviews impact perspectives on sexuality and gender, and how knowing that can be really helpful. If that sounds interesting to you, or you think that might be helpful to you, get your copy today. You can get it via our shop at livingout.org or wherever you like to get your books, or just search for Andrew Bunt and Getting God's Perspective.
Well, it's been great to hear Jeanette and Simon's stories. Guys, both as you look back and maybe as you reflect on conversations today, what do you think that people say that are both helpful and unhelpful in this area of potential change? Simon, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, I mean, I could go with some of the obvious things that are unhelpful that people might say, the like just keep praying, it'll happen kind of thing, or maybe you're not praying hard enough. I think, those things that have the built-in expectation that God answering prayer looks a specific way and looks the way that you want it to look. I think those answers are unhelpful. I think I realize more and more in myself, the focus is on Jesus, and I should be looking at who he is and what he is like, and kind of filling his vision with him. And so people being helpful are people who are encouraging me to look at Jesus. I think we can kind of get trapped in these visions of what we think godliness looks like, and it's our vision of our own version of what godliness looks like. Um, but actually, if we're encouraging people to look to Jesus and to contemplate him and his beauty, as we contemplate him, we'll grow into his picture. We won't be pushed to grow into the picture of godliness that other people have. But if people are encouraging us to look to Jesus, to contemplate him, then we'll be growing to be more and more like him. And that's the goal, being like Jesus, not being like another godly Christian who's over there serving God somewhere else. But the goal is to be being more and more like Jesus. And I think I've been reminding myself of that recently, and that has just been so helpful. And it really helps take away that comparison, those prayers of, oh, I want those normal problems someone else has, or, my life of godliness doesn't look like what I want it to be. My sexuality isn't what I was expecting. Looking to Jesus helps stop those comparisons, because we're just looking ahead to him. We're not asking what it looks like for other people. Being reminded of how wonderful he is, I think is just always helpful. I actually think a verse in Hebrews, there's so many great verses in Hebrews, but I just love thinking about Jesus not being ashamed to call us brothers and sisters, remembering that Jesus is not ashamed to call us brothers and sisters. And so really looking up to him as that older brother, that we can follow and we can trust. And we want to be like him. And that should be our goal. And I think that has really helped me, particularly in recent years, as I've been realizing, that focus of we want to be like Jesus. It doesn't matter what other people tell me I should be like. If it's not like Jesus, it's not what I want to be like.
That's great. Thanks, Simon. Jeanette, are there things people have said in the past or you think are around today that are either helpful or unhelpful?
There have been a lot of unhelpful things in the past, for sure, from fellow Christians, but thankfully that's less the case now, that people have been taught, more about identity, and to me that's the main. I do not have a gay identity. I was thinking this through, and I thought, back in the day, a teenager and 20s, my driver was sexuality. That it's almost like, because I'm gay, ABC, because I'm like this, I do that. And it was very much my driving force. And I was thinking, but that doesn't exist anymore. Over the years, that's been lessened and lessened and lessened. And the grasping the truth of our identity in Christ, and Christ in us and us in Christ. And the greater my understanding of that I died with Christ, I'm risen with Christ. The old has gone, the new has come. Living in that kind of new creation mindset helps enormously. I really need to live in it more often than I do.
I guess what you're driving at there is saying, for you, the Christian life is, how do I live out my union with Jesus, rather than how do I change my sexual attractions? Is that because they're quite different goals, aren't they? And one I think is quite healthy, and one probably less so.
Yeah, I mean, those first 15 years of my Christian walk was predominantly how do I change?
Yeah.
And so that affected my Christian growth. It was lopsided. It's like how can I live according to the Bible rather than allowing Jesus to transform me?
Hmm.
So I think there's more behavioral modification than transformation.
Hmm. I mean, I think for me, seeing this through the lens of temptation has been helpful. I mean, I'm aware there's more to say theologically on that, but in a sense, I don't think many people are seriously promising the end of all temptation this side of a new creation, and so that has helped expectations a little bit. I think for most people, whatever their temptations are, at one level, those temptations may have less of a grip on them over time by the power of the Holy Spirit. But my instinct as I talk to people is it's quite rare for a temptation to disappear entirely. And I've just found that helpful, thinking, okay, the Bible's got quite a lot to say to us in this, in terms of recognizing the power of God's Spirit living within us, enabling us to say no, and so on. And very much as you said, Jeanette, it's kind of living out this life by the Spirit. It's living out our union with Jesus, and fighting the sort of battle I think Galatians 5 envisages, actually, the sinful nature and the power of the Spirit. There will be that conflict ongoing, and so not to be discouraged when battle is part of our experience. I don't know, as a pastor, actually, occasionally people will come to me and talk to me about various temptations they're experiencing, and part of me generally says, I'm encouraged listening to you because battle is normal. I'm actually discouraged if you're not fighting. I'm discouraged if there's no battle going on. That's not great. But in as much as there is battle going on, I'm actually quite encouraged by that, because that's evidence of the Spirit at work in you. And I guess for us in our stories, the experience of ongoing battle should be a reason to encourage our conviction that we belong to the Lord, rather than discouraging us, I think. So let's try and apply this a little bit pastorally, because I guess we've kind of got to the stage in life, partly through the Lord's work in us, where we probably have a rough sense as to what's going on, maybe a rough sense as what the future might look like for us. But let's imagine a conversation with, I don't know, 18, 19-year-old, and they're talking to us and they're wrestling with same-sex attraction and they don't want to. What kind of things might we want to say to them?
I would certainly lead with encouragement. I think the fact that they're wrestling, like you just said earlier, shows life in the Spirit. And it's easy to look ahead. And I do remember thinking, how am I going to live for the next 40, 50, 60 years when all I've known is being gay and being in gay relationships? If I cut that off expression wise, how am I going to live for the next 40, 50 years? And you can look and that can be a very bleak picture, can't it? It seems so burdensome. So I would encourage the 18, 19-year-old to invest in Jesus. It's that he promises in John 10:10 an abundant life. Now, what is abundant? What does Jesus deem as abundance compared to what does society deem? The 2.5 children in the picket fence. Or what is an abundant life in Christ? And it's discipleship. It's always discipleship. Not how can I stop this feeling, but how can my growth in Christ supersede those feelings. So they may not disappear, but they will be put in their place rather than leading.
Thanks, Jeanette. Simon, your thoughts as to what you might want to say to our hypothetical 19-year-old?
Yeah, I think very similar to what has been said. I think, I would really feel that that thought of the future and thinking about what does an entire life of being faithful to Jesus look like. And I think, being encouraged to think about actually all I need to worry about is what is my next step? What am I doing today to be faithful to Jesus? How am I going to be faithful to him in this moment that I'm in right now, rather than kind of worrying about all the days that are going to happen next? Actually, being able to hand them over to God and to just ask the question of, okay, what today, what does godliness look like? Today, what does being faithful to Jesus look like? And that's a much easier question to answer than the 40-year question of what is it going to look like every day for all those years. Um, but I think we need to be encouraged to have a strange, don't think about the future too much, but also think about the future, because then you also want to have that thought of the ultimate future that we're heading towards. Think about what godliness looks like in the moment, but also take that big view of the future and go, I also know where I'm headed at the very end. I don't know all the steps in between, and thank goodness I don't. But I do know where the story's ending, and I think that's a great encouragement as well, to keep that in mind, that God has a fulfillment to his plans, and we're going to be there with Jesus celebrating at the fulfillment of all those things. And so, those two, the battle between that what to do now and thinking about that great future that God has in store, I think those are the two things that I would really want to say to someone young who's really trying to wrestle with those things. And I think in that, an encouragement to patience, another great fruit of the Spirit. This is not a quick thing. We need to be patient with ourselves, as we hand things over to God and entrust things to him. Godliness is not a quick or an easy process, and I think that's part of the point. And so, an encouragement to be patient as you can be as you are trying to live faithfully to Jesus. It is a battle, like we've been saying. Um, it's not an instant thing.
Yeah. I think I would say to my sort of hypothetical 19-year-old, I wouldn't entirely rule out change, in as much as there is some degree of fluidity around sexuality, and obviously the Lord can do anything. So I wouldn't be saying, oh, this is definitely your lifelong story, and partly experiences of same-sex attraction vary such that for some opposite-sex marriage becomes possible, and so on. So I wouldn't rule out, but I certainly wouldn't be either promising it or encouraging people to make that their supreme goal. But rather it is just holding on to God's promises, actually. So it's funny, I mentioned at the beginning that sort of 2 Corinthians 12 passage, my grace is sufficient for you. And to be honest, that becomes more and more powerful to me year on year on year. So as I'm about to enter my second half century a little bit later this year, part of it is just now being able to think, well, it's 30 years since I heard that sermon, and actually God's grace really has been sufficient for me, not least actually in giving me loving church families. And so part of me just would want to say to them, look, you will feel very weak at times, but you have all the promises of God, and actually those promises will be enough for you. His grace will be sufficient for you. We should draw to a close, but Simon, Jeanette, thank you that the vast majority of what you said was wise. So thank you so much for being with me today. Do come back and listen. We release episodes every fortnight, and there'll be further installments in this series. But for now, thank you so much for listening, and goodbye.